From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
He admitted that, yes, he did in fact spy on us. He did in fact infiltrate us. He admitted that he did pass on information to an intelligence network.
Anti-war activists in Washington state are stunned after they expose one of their friends to be an informant for the U.S. military, possible violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. The news may strengthen congressional demands for a full-scale investigation of U.S. intelligence activities like the Church Committee hearings of the 70s. We'll speak with Christopher Pyle. He was one of the investigators for the hearings. While in the military, he first exposed its widespread surveillance of civilian groups that led to those hearings. But first, a look at immigration enforcement under the Obama administration.
The American people still want to see a solution in which we are tightening up our borders. We're cracking down on employers who are using illegal workers in order to drive down wages.
A coalition of immigration activists are planning a protest today against Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano and her expansion of immigration enforcement programs like 287G that effectively give local police the powers of federal immigration agents. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. At least 18 Iraqis were killed and 27 wounded Tuesday in nationwide violence around Iraq. The toll includes 8 security guards slain in a bank robbery in Baghdad. Meanwhile, witnesses say at least 4 people were killed and scores wounded in an Iraqi military raid on the camp of an Iraq-based Iranian opposition group. The People's Mujahideen Organization, or MEK, is a U.S. ally and sworn enemy of the Iranian government. The top U.S. military commander in Iraq has suggested the U.S. Air Force will continue to control Iraqi airspace beyond the 2011 deadline for the withdrawal of all U.S. troops. On Tuesday, General Ray Odierno said Iraq won't be able to provide its own air defenses by the time U.S. forces are supposed to leave Iraq. Odierno's comments follow last week's statement by Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki that U.S. forces could remain in Iraq beyond 2011 to provide what he called, quote, training and support. Odierno's comments came as Defense Secretary Robert Gates continued an announced visit to Iraq. Gates discussed U.S. arms sales to Iraq beyond the 2011 deadline.
And so we are in the process here in 2009 in working out the kinds of equipment we might be able to transfer to the Iraqi security forces, equipment that's already here, as well as talking about purchases of new equipment by the Iraqis. And we basically will be guided by the requirements that they provide and that we develop in a dialogue with them.
As Gates visited Baghdad, hundreds of Iraqis marched in Sadr City against the U.S. occupation. Protesters waved Iraqi flags and shouted anti-occupation slogans. Meanwhile, the so-called Coalition of the Willing in Iraq is losing its junior member. British forces have until Friday to withdraw from Iraq, ending their more than 6 years as an occupying force. Iraqi lawmakers blocked a vote on an agreement that would have allowed 100 British troops to remain in Iraq beyond the Friday deadline. As British troops wind down their role in the occupation of Iraq, Colombian troops are on their way to Afghanistan. CBS News is reporting a group of elite Colombian Special Operations Forces are set to join the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan as early as next month. Colombia is the top recipient of U.S. aid in the Americas, despite having one of its worst human rights records and the world's second largest internally displaced population after Sudan. A top U.S. official told CBS News, quote, "The more Afghanistan can look like Colombia, the better." In other news from Afghanistan, 8 people were killed Tuesday in a bombing of a NATO convoy in Helmand province. The victims were all Afghan contract workers hired to escort the convoy. In Britain, a new poll shows a majority of respondents think the Afghan occupation is unwinnable and want British troops to withdraw immediately. July has been the deadliest month for foreign forces in Afghanistan since the 2001 invasion. 32 U.S. troops and 22 British troops have lost their lives. The U.S. has revoked the visas of 4 officials serving in the Honduran coup government. Ousted Honduran President Manuel Zelaya had asked the Obama administration to revoke the visas in order to increase international pressure on the coup regime. Zelaya remains in a Nicaraguan border town just outside Honduras. On Tuesday, he welcomed the latest U.S. move.
30 días, el pueblo sigue de pie resistiendo y van a pasar.
After 30 days, the people continue to be on their feet resisting, and they will continue to do so for longer. They will continue strengthening national dignity.
Darle vuelta a la opinión pública.
The coup leaders wanted to change public, national, and international opinion, but they haven't been able to do so. The people who are with them out of necessity and to be able to eat and live. But those in the armed forces and the government know that what they have done is wrong and it is destroying the country.
The Iranian government has freed around 140 prisoners swept up in the recent crackdown on opposition members and protesters following last month's disputed national elections. Iran says another 150 prisoners remain at the jail, but the number could be higher. Prisoners have come forward with allegations of widespread torture at the jail. Iran, meanwhile, says it shut down the notorious Karzak jail that's been notorious for the abuse of prisoners. The moves follow days of worldwide protests held to call for the prisoners' freedom. In Nigeria, the death toll from clashes between Muslim fighters and government forces over the last 3 days has reached 150 people. On Tuesday, government forces shelled the headquarters of a radical Muslim sect in the northern Bomo state. A Muslim worshiper in the Nigerian city of Lagos urged an ending to the fighting.
There's a way to settle issues between both parties. So I don't see a reason why people should be killing themselves for nothing.
At Guantanamo, a teenage Afghan prisoner has been transferred to a section reserved for those cleared for release. The prisoner, Mohammed Jawad, was as young as 12 at the time of his capture 7 years ago in Afghanistan. Last week, the Obama administration admitted it could no longer hold Jawad as an enemy combatant after a federal judge ruled his confession was obtained through torture. But it had asked to continue imprisoning Jawad until deciding whether to bring him to the U.S. for a criminal trial. On Tuesday, the Afghan government said it's prepared to send a plane to bring Jawad home. In Britain, the human rights group Reprieve has filed suit against the British government over the rendition and torture of a former Guantanamo prisoner. Reprieve says Britain allowed the rendition of Mohammed Madri through the U.S. airbase on the British-controlled island of Diego Garcia. Madni spent 3 months in Egypt, where he was tortured and then sent to Guantanamo, where he was jailed for 6 years until his 2008 release. Reprieve Director Clive Stafford Smith called on the British government to issue an apology.
I think the first thing that the British government needs to say to Mr. Madni are 3 simple words: we are sorry. You know, that's the most important thing for a victim under these circumstances. And for Mr. Madni, he wants to make sure that rules are set in place to make sure no one else is put in this situation in the future. He's suffered already, but he doesn't want other people to suffer the sort of torture and abuse he's been through.
Smith says the case could bring the first official confirmation of British involvement in the rendition of U.S. prisoners across multiple borders. Back in the United States, the Senate Judiciary Committee has voted to back Supreme Court nominee Sonia Sotomayor. The 13-6 vote split along party lines, with the exception of Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who voted with the Democratic majority.
I feel good about the country. I feel really good about the American people. And quite frankly, I feel good about Judge Sotomayor. This is the first Latino woman in the history of the United States to be selected for the Supreme Court. Now, that is a big deal. I would not have chosen her, but I understand why President Obama did.
Democratic Senator Arlen Specter, a former Republican, meanwhile, said he supported the wise Latina comment that was scrutinized by Sotomayor's critics.
And when she refers to being a Latino, that's a little ethnic pride. I think that's a pretty healthy thing, to have a little ethnic pride. So I not only found I didn't find fault with a wise Latino woman. I thought it was commendable.
The full Senate is expected to confirm Sotomayor in a vote next week. In other news from Capitol Hill, a House panel has backed a measure that would allow limits on executive salaries at financial firms with assets of over $1 billion. On Tuesday, the House Financial Services Committee voted to advance a proposal giving regulators authority to curb, quote, inappropriate or imprudently risky compensation. U.S. regulators are moving towards imposing limits on speculation in oil and other commodities. On Tuesday, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission said it would release a report next month blaming the rise on oil prices on financial speculators. That would reverse the CFTC's stance under the Bush administration, which rejected financial speculation as a cause and instead linked a record-setting price hike to support and demand. CFCT Commissioner Bart Chilton now says that position relied on, quote, deeply flawed data. In California, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger has sparked a new row with Democratic legislators after adding hundreds of millions of dollars in last-minute spending cuts to a budget bill shortly before signing it into law. The $449 million in new cuts target programs Schwarzenegger had agreed to keep following weeks of negotiations with Democrats on closing California's estimated $26 billion budget gap. The programs provide services for children, the poor, and abused women. The new cuts come on top of the initial budget plan that reduces welfare payments, slashes education funding, and will likely strip tens of thousands of seniors and children of access to health care. Schwarzenegger says he added the new cuts to overcome a shortfall created by the rejection of generating revenue through drilling off Santa Barbara and swapping local gas taxes. But Democrats say they plan to challenge the cuts' legality. Here in New York, demonstrators gathered at ABC News Manhattan headquarters Tuesday to present a petition against the exclusion of a single-payer option from coverage on health care reform. Earlier this month, ABC News disinvited President Obama's former physician, Dr. David Scheiner, from a televised forum. Scheiner had planned to question Obama about his rejection of single-payer. The petition was organized by the group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Fair Communications Director Isabel McDonald said the exclusion of single-payer extends across the major corporate networks.
59% of Americans and 59% of physicians support a Medicare for All type program or single payer. ABC has not had a single advocate of that system on air this year. So we're delivering a petition to both ABC and we're also sending a message to the other TV networks demanding that they cover single-payer health care and stop silencing single-payer advocates.
The petition's 11,000 signatories include filmmaker Michael Moore, former MSNBC host Phil Donahue, Dr. Quentin Young, and actors Tim Robbins and Susan Sarandon. In Kansas, the suspect in the killing of abortion doctor George Tiller has pleaded not guilty on all charges. Dr. Tiller was murdered on May 31st during Sunday services at his Wichita church. The suspect, Scott Roeder, is set to go on trial in September. On Tuesday, 2 eyewitnesses appeared at Roeder's pretrial hearing and identified him as the killer. In Tennessee, an internal inquiry says the Tennessee Valley Authority failed for more than 2 decades to heed warnings that could have prevented a massive coal ash spill last December. The TVA Inspector General also says the authority's lawyers then quashed a $3 million study into the spill's cause in order to limit its legal liability. The Kingston fossil plant spill released more than 1 billion gallons of toxic coal ash, burying homes and roads. It's believed to be the largest coal ash disaster in U.S. history. In North Carolina, 7 people have been charged with plotting to support militant Islamist groups overseas. The Justice Department says there's no indication the suspects planned on carrying out attacks in the United States. The men are accused of backing jihadist groups in Israel, Jordan, Kosovo, and Pakistan. And at least 15 Haitian migrants have drowned after their boat capsized and sank off the Turks and Caicos Islands. At least 65 people remain missing. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today with a look at immigration enforcement under the Obama administration. Earlier this month, Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano announced the expansion of the controversial 287G program to 11 new locations across the country. This program allows local law enforcement agencies to enter into agreements with Homeland Security's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. It effectively gives local police the powers of federal immigration agents. 287G agreements have been widely criticized for increasing racial profiling and singling out immigrants for arrest without suspicion of crime. In Napolitano's home state of Arizona, particularly under Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio, the 287G program's plagued with serious reports of abuse. The Obama administration's also decided to expand and strengthen implementation of other controversial programs like E-Verify and Secure Communities. E-Verify is an electronic system that checks people's eligibility to work, and Secure Communities brings ICE agents into local jails to identify and deport undocumented prisoners. Well, here in New York, a coalition of immigration activists are gathering outside the Council on Foreign Relations today at the time of this broadcast, where Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano is giving a speech about terrorism. The activists are protesting Napolitano's expansion of immigration enforcement programs and calling for an end to abuses by ICE. For more on this, we're joined by two guests in the Firehouse studio. Arti Shahani is the lead author of Local Democracy on ICE, a report on the 287G program by the nonpartisan Criminal Justice Institute Justice Strategies. She's also co-founder of Families for Freedom. Roberto Lovato is contributing associate editor with New America Media and a frequent contributor to The Nation and the Huffington Post. He was previously the executive director of the Central American Resource Center, CARECEN, then the country's largest immigrant rights organization. He blogs at ofamerica.wordpress.com. We welcome you both to Democracy Now!
Thank you.
Okay, let's begin with you, Arti Shahani. 287G, can you explain more fully what it means?
Absolutely. The 287G program is essentially the program that turns traffic cops and jail guards into deportation agents. 287G refers to a piece of law passed in 1996 under then-President Bill Clinton, but turned into an all-out program to recruit law enforcement into the deportation agenda under the Bush administration. Our understanding, those of us who were watching Obama and had hopes in Obama, was that under Obama, programs like 287G would be terminated because they are driven off of a desire for racial profiling. Officers that want to be able to have the power to pick up Latinos, brown people while driving, these are the self-selecting group of people that join into 287G. And unfortunately, 2 weeks ago, Napolitano gave us our first really blatant betrayal when she decided not only not to suspend 287G, but to expand it around the country. Notably, she gave this program, she reinitiated the contract with Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County, Arizona. Mind you, Joe Arpaio is currently under federal investigation. The Department of Justice, Eric Holder, is investigating his use of the program. Meanwhile, Napolitano is going ahead and handing it off to him. Among the other participants that were recruited newly into the program, Arpaio is an old participant in it. A new recruit is, for example, Morristown, New Jersey, where the chief of police himself had no idea his own agency was being recruited into 287G. Last night, Morristown had a community meeting of 150 community members where people, for example, a woman said, listen, imagine if you're a victim of domestic violence. If we have this program in Morristown, New Jersey, how can you call the police? Because the police will come, they will deport your husband, even if you don't want that, and they could even deport you. This was a fear. There was another anecdote last night about a guy in Morristown, actually a white guy who loves bachata music. He was saying that I was driving in my convertible the other day, top down, listening to my bachata. The police stopped me. They don't even have 287G yet. The police stopped me and said in Spanish, give me your driver's license. And they spoke worse Spanish than me, and I responded in Spanish as a white guy. I don't even, I gave them the driver's license, responded in Spanish, and it was so clear that they assumed that I was Latino because I don't have blue eyes, because I'm Italian-American. And so you can see that the places where this program is really coming up are places that want to do racial profiling. And Napolitano's decision to go ahead and expand the program, I think, needs to be taken by those who are watching as a real misstep. There is right now, for example, even within the Democratic Party, people were pissed at her in large part because Democrats that have been campaigning for a comprehensive immigration reform want to be able to trade off enforcement for legalization. And so within the Democratic Party, there was some criticism that strategically Napolitano is just handing off enforcement through things like 287G and E-Verify, rather than letting them being able to trade it off for legalization down the line. So there's, on a lot of fronts, she's disappointed a lot of people.
How does it work in Maricopa in Arizona?
So, I mean, how it works is a great question, and it really seems to work different ways in different places. The fundamental thing about 287G is ICE is marketing it as a program that targets criminal, illegal aliens, the worst of the worst. But there's a baseline fact, which is that police already have the power to arrest people for crimes. That power rests in criminal law. And so 287G comes in precisely when you lack reasonable suspicion of a crime, when you lack evidence, and when you're trying to hold someone on a civil immigration detainer, because under a civil immigration detainer, you don't have the same constitutional protections as a regular criminal arrest. So 287G basically opens the gateway for sloppy policing. That's why law enforcement officers like Joe Arpaio, Joe Arpaio has told me, 287G takes the handcuffs off of law enforcement. That's why we want it there. The way that it's worked in Maricopa County is through these quote-unquote crime suppression sweeps, where really what you have is the sheriff's deputies and then a volunteer force that includes people that are white nationalists going around the city or going around the county, going into different areas in Mesa and rounding people up. That's how it's been working over there.
This is what, at the time, Governor Napolitano presided over it. Is it fair to say that, presided over?
Napolitano actually brokered the first 287G program in Arizona and then helped Arpaio to get his. Now, one way that she's really speaking out of both sides of her mouth over here is that she is saying that my administration, Homeland Security under me is going to clean up the detention system. We've had upwards of 100 deaths in civil immigration detention. It's a totally mismanaged system that's grown from 5,000 in 1994 to over 40,000 today. And she has actually brought in a corrections guru, Dora Schiro, who knows all about managing corrections, to come and clean up the system. So she's saying, we're going to get basic standards in detention, we're going to manage it properly. So that's one side of her mouth. And the other side of her mouth is expanding this program, which is basically a backdoor way to add anywhere between 2,000 and 10,000 new beds in detention without calling it that. The fact is, Joe Arpaio isn't just running a program that picks Latinos off of the streets for being Latino. He's then throwing these same people into Tent City, a jail that's not even accredited anymore federally because its standards are so poor, and holding them there de facto as immigration civil detainees. So it makes no sense that on the one hand, Napolitano says we're going to clean up detention, and on the other hand, through 287G, she continues to rely on Joe's beds.
We're going to go to break and come back to this discussion. Arti Shahani is the lead author in Local Democracy on ICE, a report on the 287G program by the Nonpartisan Criminal Justice Institute. And we'll be joined by Roberto Lovato. As we speak, a protest is going on outside the Council on Foreign Relations, where Janet Napolitano is speaking about terrorism. Stay with us.
En la frontera de México y Estados Unidos. La raza que va en busca del sueño americano tiene que enfrentarse con la ambición de los polleros que los tranzan y los los atracan y los extorsionan. Y con tal de ganarse una lana, no les importa vender a los de su propia raza. Muchas cosas muy tristes pasan a diario.
El Tres, Sueño Americano, American Dream. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're talking about immigration policy in this country. Janet Napolitano, former governor of Arizona, now Secretary of Homeland Security, is in New York to address the Council of Foreign Relations. A major protest is going on outside. Our guests are Arti Shahani, lead author of Local Democracy on ICE, and Roberto Lovato, contributing associate editor with New America Media. I wanted to turn for a moment to President President Obama. President Obama spoke last month about his plans for immigration reform. This is a brief excerpt of what he had to say. Then I'll get your responses.
I think the consensus is that despite our inability to get this passed over the last several years, the American people still want to see a solution in which we are tightening up our borders, we're cracking down on employers who are using illegal workers in order to drive down wages and oftentimes mistreat those workers, and we need a effective way to recognize and legalize the status of undocumented workers who are here. My administration is fully behind an effort to achieve comprehensive immigration reform. I have asked my Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Janet Napolitano, to lead up a group that is going to be working with a leadership group from both the House and the Senate to start systematically working through these issues from the congressional leaders and those with the relevant jurisdiction. What we've heard is through a process of regular order, they would like to work through these issues both in the House and in the Senate.
Roberto Lovato, why don't we begin with you? Your response to President Obama.
Well, I think we all applaud some form of reform in what is proven to be the most decrepit, ill-managed and rotten system. When you talk about the 100 deaths that Arti mentioned and all the people that aren't being fed or that are being fed bologna that's rotten and just really nasty things.
When you say fed bologna that's rotten, you're talking about Joseph Arpaio.
Joe Arpaio's jail, feeding people bologna, dressing them in pink. I mean, so there's a whole system of humiliation, death, and disgrace upon the Obama administration that's not really talked about when you have these big meetings with senators or when President Obama goes before, say, the NAACP, as he did on July 15th, or when he's going to have his couple of beers with Henry Louis Gates and the policeman. You know, in those meetings, we hear a lot about civil rights and about how far we've come and how far we need to go, and we even have mention of racial profiling. But then it's taken back. And what's not taken back is the fact that 287G that Arti described is one of the most massive racial profiling programs of the federal government in history. And the announcement of this, Amy, is really interesting. The 287G expansion, a lot of people were just expecting that it was going to be closed down. That's why they're protesting at the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York right now. Thought that, you know, with Obama, there was a new day in race and racial profiling, and 287G and Joe Arpaio are done. In fact, they're expanding that program. And as a result, they're expanding a program that has been proven to profile, prosecute, persecute, and jail, and terrorize a lot of people. It's funny that Janet Napolitano is talking about terrorism. I've been around the country interviewing undocumented immigrants pretty much everywhere except a few states in the Northeast. I've seen people hands shake like they did when I was in El Salvador, or their faces twitch. That's terror. That's post-traumatic stress disorder that's caused by that. So a lot of activists, I think, are finding hypocrisy on a historic scale made by a historic new presidency in terms of them talking about preventing terrorism or being against racial profiling, when in fact the 287G program and other programs like it foster new and extreme levels of terrorism and racial profiling. There's a lot of people that aren't very happy with the Obama administration, and you see the split that Arti mentioned. There are groups that are more sympathetic and close to the Democrats in Washington, D.C., and those groups are very good about talking about legalization. National Council of La Raza, National Immigration Forum, and others are more than happy to talk about legalization, and they'll criticize on the side detention, but they won't make reform of the detention system, abolishing the most racist program, one of the most racist programs of the federal government, a part of comprehensive immigration reform. So when you hear, and when we hear, and when your audience hears the words comprehensive immigration reform, that's code for legalization in exchange for even more programs like 287G, more laws that are going to prosecute, persecute, jail, and probably end up killing more immigrants. And so comprehensive immigration reform, everybody, is code for more enforcement in exchange for legalization.
Archie Shahani.
I echo what Roberto says, and I think that there's another point to keep in mind about programs like 287G. Right now, there is space to reconsider what is going to happen with our immigration system. Under Bush, we were set back. Immigration, for the first time in history, became institutionalized as a homeland security issue. Back in 2002, 2003, there were people who were saying immigration does not belong in homeland security. It is not a counterterrorism issue. If anything, it's a labor issue. It's an international relations issue. Put it in the State Department, so on and so forth. So right now, given that we're not touching comprehensive immigration reform until healthcare, which could be 4 months or 4 years, who knows, right? Given that we're not touching it until then, now is the time for the Obama administration and the people who are watching the Obama administration to really flag a few issues. One is that we need to turn away from the Bush policy of attrition. Okay, what Janet Napolitano is calling partnerships with local law enforcement agencies, she keeps on talking about this great word of partnerships, that's in fact a war of attrition. When you go ahead and you enlist and deputize, what could be thousands of agencies to start basically being deportation agents, you're bringing the border to the interior. That's not policy that makes sense. That is Bush-era policy, and that is bringing a reign of terror into communities that are, at this point, hands trembling, afraid to leave. People have already left Morristown, New Jersey, before 287G has even gotten there because of fear. These are things that we can't afford to allow to happen. I think the other thing is that there is a real struggle right now in terms of the controlling this debate. And you had, for example, under the Bush administration, you had the Police Foundation, whose president is Hubert Williams, testifying against programs like 287G, saying this is a terrible idea. Police don't want to engage in racial profiling. Now the danger is that because we have a Democratic administration, Democratic leaders are not going to speak out against these same policies. There's been no substantive change in 287G. In fact, the program may have worsened between Bush and Obama. But suddenly, Democrats are afraid to call out Democrats on this. This is something that we have to keep very aware of because it's now harder to be indignant about the same injustices that are happening.
Archie Shahani, in addition to your report, Democracy on Ice, the Benjamin Cardozo Law School just put out a report on the abuses by ICE officers here in this area, in Staten Island and New Jersey. Can you talk about the significance of their findings?
Cardozo School of Law Immigration Clinic put out a phenomenal report, actually called Constitution on Ice. It seems like a lot of things are on ice these days. But Constitution on Ice really deals with the abuse of immigration detainers. Okay, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this report, what it does is documents that ICE has been conducting home raids exponentially more and more since about 2002. For these home raids, ICE issues for itself a warrant to go ahead into somebody's home when they're trying to apprehend people that they call absconders, fugitive aliens, people with old deportation orders or possibly people with old criminal convictions, okay? ICE goes into homes, and what Cardozo documented through FOIA requests and through getting information, forcing it out, was that consistently ICE was violating the terms of the warrants that they issue for themselves. They were physically breaking into homes. They were doing collateral arrests. So we're here looking for Juan Diego. Oh, Juan Diego's here? Well, we'll take Jimena Diego and Pablo Diego and whoever else happens to be. There are plenty of Pakistanis and Bangladeshis as well. So what Cardozo School of Law did was document what basically people have known anecdotally, which is that ICE is not abiding by the terms of the detainer. They're going ahead and rapidly abusing the detainer. And again, to tie this back to 287G, if Cardozo School of Law has documented that ICE is abusing detainers, 287G gives regular criminal law enforcement the power to also issue and abuse detainers. ICE can't manage its own detainer system. How is it going to oversee other officers doing it? I don't know.
And the way they go into these houses, shotguns,
You have people, I mean, it's crazy. You're talking about, SWAT teams of 7 to 10 officers, bulletproof vests, shotguns. They recently, or under the Bush administration, they changed up their jackets. It used to say ICE, now it says ICE police. Technically, ICE isn't supposed to be police. They're not criminal law enforcement officials or civil authorities, at least the ones that are going in for these raids. I mean, you have people like, I know, for example, a family in Brooklyn, they're members of families, in the Bronx, members of Families for Freedom, where an 11-year-old girl had to basically answer the door at 6 a.m. to a team of 8 ICE officers busting in, looking for her father. Her father was in the shower getting cleaned up for work, taking her father and then taking her uncle, who wasn't even listed on their warrant. So this is the way that detainers are basically being used and abused under the Obama administration as well.
Do you see this changing at all?
It changes if we say it, right? It changes if we talk about it and expose it. There's a deep concern right now that there's never been a more important moment, I think, politically, and an opportunity, frankly, to call out what's happening for the sake of redefining the agenda. The fact is the Obama administration should stop treating immigration as a counterterrorism project. They should stop this war of attrition, this devolution of immigration authority. They should stop this rapid use of detainers, this expansive use of detainers. It's probably in violation of the detainer laws. And mind you, everything I've listed is administratively what they can do. Short of comprehensive immigration reform, there's so much that the Obama administration could be doing right now, but it seems like what they could be doing is directly opposite to what they are doing.
And final recommendations from your report from Democracy on Ice beyond what you've just described.
I mean, we recommended in Local Democracy on Ice that you terminate the 287G program entirely because it does not serve a public safety function. We also recommended that that we create real reporting requirements for ICE to continue to receive funding. We are in a moment of economic crisis. ICE's budget continues to grow. It's over $6 billion today, which is larger than the budget of all of Haiti. It's over $6 billion today. It's continuing to grow. It's continuing to get money from appropriations. And while our appropriators in Congress are pumping money into ICE, our Democratic appropriators are pumping money into ICE, they're not creating any real reporting requirements so we can assess the effectiveness of the agency. So those are some basic recommendations we have.
Roberto Lovato, comment on that, and then I want to ask you about Honduras, a recent interview you did with a leading labor activist with the ongoing coup there.
Well, Artie laid out very comprehensively a system that people like scholars at Lewis and Clark University, Juliet Stumpf, call crimmigration. It's basically a system of interlacing laws and enforcement practices that lead to profiling, prosecuting, and jailing exponential numbers of Latinos in much the same way, for example, that drug laws prosecuted, jailed African Americans, Latinos, and other poor people in exponential numbers. So there's a new industry afoot, the kind of migration industrial complex that's driven by things like what some call crimmigration, and the Obama administration seems more than willing to entertain it if a report by Syracuse University is right that tracks immigration, prosecution, and detention. It shows that we're now reaching, quote, levels seen during the Bush administration, the highest levels during the Bush administration. So if you're concerned about civil rights, immigrant rights, Latino issues, African-American poor people's issues, and you've been thinking about breaking with Barack Obama, you may want to join people over at the Council on Foreign Relations and other cities around the United States where now I think the Obama administration, Janet Napolitano, and President Obama are going to be targeted by groups that are fed up with the jailing, prosecuting, racial profiling, terror, and death of it all.
Honduras, very quickly, Roberto Lovato.
I interviewed Berta Oliva, a preeminent world-recognized human rights activist, head of the Committee of the Families of the Detained and Disappeared. And I was basically interviewing about Secretary Clinton's comments last week about the entrance of President Zelaya into Honduras as being, quote, reckless.
The fact that he went to the border in Nicaragua.
Right. Yeah, she said that it was reckless, and I asked Ms. Oliva what she thought, and she thought that Secretary Clinton was being, quote, reckless. And she said, well, right now we just had a bombing yesterday, and unfortunately Fortunately, there was nobody killed by the bombing because everybody from that union that was bombed was over at the funeral of one of the victims, the latest victims of the death squad killings, which will give you some sense of the situation that Berta Oliva believes that Secretary Clinton and President Obama are actually enabling, which is, what are they communicating to people that are bombing unions, killing people, disappearing people, doing things that many of us remember and tremble at the thought of returning right now. And so when she hears Secretary Clinton saying this, she's outraged, like many people I've spoken to, about the lack of support for democracy, as we hear voiced in the case of Iran.
And we will certainly continue to follow developments in the coup in Honduras. This is Democracy Now! I want to thank you both for being with us. Roberto Lovato, contributing associate editor at New America Media, previously executive director of CORESAN, the Central American Resource Center, and Arti Shahani, thank you for being with us, lead author on Local Democracy on ICE, a report on 287G program by the Nonpartisan Criminal Justice Institute, Justice Strategies. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to a follow-up on our exclusive broadcast yesterday, we spent the hour looking at a story out of Olympia, Washington, where anti-war activists exposed Army spying and infiltration of their groups, as well as intelligence gathering by the Air Force, the Federal Capitol Police, and the Coast Guard. Declassified documents obtained by the activists revealed that an active member of Students for a Democratic Society and Port Militarization Resistance in Washington state was actually an informant for the U.S. military. The man everyone knew as John Jacob was in fact John Towery, a member of the Force Protection Service at Fort Lewis. The infiltration appears to be in direct violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, preventing U.S. military deployment for domestic law enforcement, and may strengthen congressional demands for a full-scale investigation of U.S. intelligence activities, like the Church Committee hearings of the 70s. Well, Christopher Pyle was a captain in Army intelligence in 1970 when he first disclosed the military's widespread surveillance of civilian groups. The disclosure triggered 50 congressional inquiries within a month. Pyle went on to work for Senator Sam Ervin's Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights and Senator Frank Church's Select Committee on Intelligence that led to the founding of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Christopher Pyle joins us now from Chicopee, Massachusetts. He teaches constitutional law and civil liberties at Mount Holyoke College, and he's the author of 4 books. His most recent is called Getting Away with Torture. We welcome you to Democracy Now!
Good morning, Amy.
I wanted you to first start off by talking about the significance of these revelations yesterday, with the young activists on Democracy Now! Having simply applied under Freedom of Information Act for any information on anarchists or on their organizations in Olympia, Washington, and finding this one email inside that referred to this man named John Towery. They started doing some digging, and they realized it was their friend. Well, they knew him as John Jacob. He came out of Fort Lewis base. Christopher Pyle, the significance of this.
I think the significance is less that the Army is monitoring civilian political activity than that there is a network, a nationwide network of fusion centers, these state police
intelligence units, these municipal police intelligence units, that bring together the services of the military, of police, and even private corporations to share information about alleged terrorist groups in cities throughout the country. I was fascinated by the story of the Air Force officer from New Jersey making an inquiry to the police in the state of Washington about this group. This is an enormous network. It's funded by the Homeland Security Department. Police departments get a great deal of money to set up these intelligence units, and they monitor largely lawful political activity in violation of the First Amendment, and when the military is involved, in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act.
I wanted to play just two clips from yesterday. This is one of the activists in Olympia who exposed that his friend John Jacobs was actually John Towery, a military informant and a member of the Force Protection Service at Fort Lewis. I asked Brendan Maslakis-Dunn, the Olympia activist with Students for a Democratic Society and Port Militarization Resistance, what his first reaction was when he found out.
John Jacob was actually a close friend of mine, so this week it's been pretty difficult for me. He said he was an anarchist. I met him over 2 years ago through community organizing and anti-war organizing I was involved with in Tacoma and Olympia with other anarchists and other activists. And he was really interested in Students for a Democratic Society. He wanted to start a chapter of Movement for a Democratic Society, which is connected to SDS. He got involved with Port Militarization Resistance, with Iraq Vets Against the War. He was, knew a lot of people involved with that organization. But he was a friend of mine. We hung out. We gave workshops together on grassroots direct democracy and anarchist struggle. I mean, he was a friend. A lot of people really did like him. He was a kind person. He was a generous person. So it was really just a shock for me this week when all of this was determined.
Brendan Maslakis-Dunn went on to describe exactly what his so-called friend John Towery said when he confronted him with the evidence.
He admitted that, yes, he did in fact spy on us. He did in fact infiltrate us. He admitted that he did pass on information to an intelligence network, which, as you mentioned earlier, was composed of dozens of law enforcement agencies ranging from municipal to county to state to regional, and several federal agencies, including Immigration Customs Enforcement, Joint Terrorism Task Force, FBI, Homeland Security, the Army, and Fort Lewis. So he admitted to other things too. He admitted that the police had placed a surveillance camera across the street from a community center in Tacoma that anarchists ran called the Pitch Pipe Info Shop. He admitted that there were police that did put a camera up there to spy on anarchists, on activists going there. He also, one other thing he spoke of, I don't know if this is true, I mean, honestly, I don't know what to believe from John, but he said that the police in Tacoma and Olympia had been planning for a while on raiding the anarchist Pitch Pipe Info Shop, and also the house I lived in with several other activists in Olympia, and they had approached John several times saying, do they have bombs and explosives and drugs and guns and things like that, which is just disgusting to even think that they would suggest that. They're just trying to silence us politically. They're going after us for our politics and for our work, around port militarization resistance, around anti-war organizing. And of course, John told them, no, we didn't have any of those stuff. He told them the truth. But he also mentioned that there were other informants that are amongst us.
Brendan Maslakis-Dunn, the Olympia activist with Students for a Democratic Society and Port Militarization Resistance, the one who put in the Freedom of Information Act request and found out his friend, who he thought was named John Jacob, was John Towery out of Fort Lewis base in Washington State. Christopher Pyle, you're now a professor. You were in military intelligence, a captain. When you started to uncover the military, almost 40 years ago, investigating civilian groups. Give us the history.
Well, I was teaching law at the U.S. Army Intelligence School, and I was asked to teach a class on CONUS intelligence and spot reports. CONUS is the acronym for Continental United States. So I delivered a lecture about the need for the use of the military to put down riots, which did not require identifying any persons. You simply go in, clear the streets, declare a curfew, quiet things down, restore order. And the officer came up to me after class and said, "Captain Pyle, you don't know much about this, do you?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I can arrange a briefing," and he did. He took me across the post to the headquarters of the U.S. Army Intelligence Command's CONUS Intelligence Section. There I discovered 13 teletype machines reporting on every demonstration around the country of 20 people or more. The reports were coming from 1,500 Army plainclothes agents working out of 300 offices. They had it all covered. They showed me a mug book of persons who could be rounded up in case of a civil disturbance. The military really believed that if you had a civil disturbance or a protest, it was very important to know the names of the people who might be protesting, because you never know, they might be connected with a cadre of agitators and communists behind them. Well, the same pattern is now developing under the U.S. Army's Northern Command, which coordinates domestic intelligence work for the U.S. Army and tries to prepare for what they call military assistance to civil authorities. It was out of this the Talon reports came that I also helped to disclose. Reports on lawful, constitutionally protected anti-war activities. And
who were some of the people in the mugshots, Christopher Pyle? Who did they say could be rounded up?
The first volume, under letter A, was Ralph David Abernathy, who was head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and a close associate of Dr. Martin Luther King. And there were many more of that type.
So you're saying
law-abiding citizens.
So you're saying some protest happened somewhere, or a riot, and they can go to where Ralph David Abernathy is in a wholly different place and round him up?
Yes, today particularly with the power of computers and internet communications and monitoring the public airwaves, this network of 72 fusion centers, plus all of the subordinate groups that provide information and seek information, can follow you and me and just about anybody all around the country. They don't have to put transponders in our cars. They could use Easy Pass on the highway. But in your case, from the state of Washington, they apparently used a transponder in an anti-war protester's automobile. This is the kind of surveillance society this country does not need.
Who else was listed at the time?
Say that again?
Who else was listed at the time, both individuals and organizations that you saw targeted?
Well, one of the printouts that the military gave me of their surveillance for a particular week in 1968 included the infiltration of a Unitarian church. In more recent years, surveillance of Quaker groups, the infiltration of Quaker groups in Florida who were planning to protest military recruitment in their local high school. These are the people who, according to the Talon reports, are considered to be potential threats to military security.
And explain what you mean by Talon.
Talon is a collection of intelligence reports of threats to military bases that were collected by an unknown group for many years after 9/11 called the Counterintelligence Field Activity. It had 1,000 employees, was located in the Pentagon, and it was monitoring civil disturbances around the country. Following a pattern very much like the 1960s and 70s. The idea was that if you could follow enough protests in the country, or enough disturbances, you could tell when the country was going to overheat and the military would have to be called in. In the 1960s, they thought that if they could tell how many protests there were on college campuses, they could then predict riots in the black ghettos of the major cities of the United States. It was ludicrous intelligence work, but that's what they had in mind.
So you left there that day saying you were going to write an article. You were going to expose this. You learned about huge databases, places like in Baltimore, Maryland?
Well, the big center was in Baltimore, Maryland, but there were 6 other computer data banks back then. Computers were still in their infancy. They were still being fed with computer punch cards, nothing like we have today. They were Bush League compared to what now exists in these fusion centers that you've reported on from the state of Washington.
And what happened as a result of this information? You're a military intelligence captain. You're appalled by what you see, the targeting of civilians. You write an article. What ensued?
Well, what was really interesting is I began to hear from my former students who had been doing this work on active duty. And I eventually recruited 125 counterintelligence agents to tell what they knew about the domestic intelligence operations of the U.S. Army. I shared this information with the press and with congressional committees. Senator Ervin in the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights held hearings, which I organized, and disclosed the existence of this system. The military was embarrassed by the system and eventually disbanded it and burned all the records. I checked on that by interviewing the guys who did the burning of the records.
There's a discussion right now among the people who are involved, Congressmember Barbara Lee in New Jersey, Rush Holt, Congressman, Chair of the Judiciary Committee, Conyers, weighing a committee be set up to once again investigate, as the Church Committee did, intelligence in this country and its far-reaching effects. For example, the example we brought out yesterday of the military infiltrating peace groups, and this was just one individual that we looked at. Talk about what came from the Ervin and the Church Committee hearings.
Well, the Church Committee did the most extensive investigation of all the agencies. Ervin's committee just did Army intelligence, but nobody had ever done anything to investigate intelligence agencies before Senator Ervin took it upon himself to do so. Once Ervin proved that there was extensive misconduct and abuse of authority, then others got interested, and the House created a committee under Otis Pike, and the Senate created a special committee under Frank Church. They had to create special committees because there were no standing committees to oversee the intelligence agencies. And as the result of the work of those 2 committees, we now have standing congressional committees whose job is supposed to be to oversee the work of the intelligence committees. So the proposal for yet another select committee to do the work of existing committees seems to me a political non-starter. But maybe Barbara Lee knows something more about the politics of Capitol Hill than I do.
What do you think needs to be done right now?
I think that we need to prosecute the torturers. I think that's the biggest single message that we could give to the intelligence community, that it is not above the law. That's even more important than the domestic intelligence, and the domestic intelligence to me is extremely important. That's the untold story that you've begun to tell, but there have been many other abuses of authority, and when you get into torture, kidnapping, secret illegal detention, and assassination, it seems to me you've gone over the hill to the most serious abuses any intelligence community can possibly commit. And that's the place to start. Don't lose our focus on that. And then after that, we need to investigate ways of curbing domestic intelligence activity. And there's an area of this which has not yet become publicly known, and that is the role of corporations working with the intelligence agencies. Corporations which do data processing and data mining, which are totally exempt from any state or federal privacy laws. There's no control on them at all. And when they're part of this network, they can use Google and techniques like Google, sophisticated techniques, to gather a great deal of information on the personal lives of the young men you had on your program yesterday.
Christopher Pyle, this is just the beginning, and we're going to have you back. Your new book, Getting Away with Torture. Christopher Pyle was a military intelligence captain when he exposed the surveillance of civilian groups in this country. Now a professor at Mount Holyoke College. Thank you for being with us. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Berkshire, Kader Sauermonte, Angelique Comet, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Hani Massoud, Robbie Karen. Our best to the Steve Martinez's family. We hope you recover quickly. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Peter Curry is our engineers. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.